Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello, hi everyone. Hi, thank you so much for joining. My name is Fatima Khan and I'm a journalist at ThePrint. Thank you so much everyone who's tuned in to watch this live chat and interact with me. Just to give you a little bit of a background, this is a new video series that ThePrint has started. It's called Reporter Direct. Here you, good subscribers who subscribed to ThePrint, can actually send in your questions to the reporter, who today is me, and I shall be taking your live questions and I shall attempt to answer them. These can be questions relevant to the stories that I've done in the past, my experience reporting on the field, and anything relevant that you might have to ask on those subjects. Thank you so much. I'd like to start by thanking all of you here, all the subscribers, good viewers, and readers like yourself. It is because of you that we can continue doing what we want to. We can continue going out on the field and bringing you relevant stories. So I'd really like to thank all of you on behalf of ThePrint for that. Please continue to read us and watch us. And yeah, I think in today's 40-45 minutes, you can feel free to ask me any question that you want, and I'd like to be as honest and as frank as possible in answering them to you. Right. So just a little bit about myself. At ThePrint, I cover politics and policy and social justice. And for the last almost a month, I've been out on the field covering COVID pandemic, the second surge of COVID. I've traveled to various parts of Uttar Pradesh and then Madhya Pradesh in order to bring you relevant stories about how the health infrastructure is coping with this deadly, devastating second surge that the country witnessed. We've gone to various parts of rural Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh to see how people there are coping with this second surge, how poorer, more remote areas are dealing with the magnanimity of what has happened. We've also gone to various hospitals, big hospitals that at this moment, especially during the peak of the second surge, were crumbling because of just the intensity of the number of deaths and the number of cases that we saw surging at that point. We've also done several human interest stories that, for a lot of our viewers who wrote back to us after that saying that, look, this was really emotional for us to read. These are stories of people who have honestly this sense of great betrayal almost that they feel. They cannot imagine, they cannot fathom what has happened with them. These are people who have lost one or two or multiple family members. And it has been truly devastating for them, the experience. So we've covered all of that and more. And I'd like to, at this point, start taking in some questions. Please feel free at any point. There is a Q&A that you will see where you can just type and send your question. And through the course of this session, I will take your questions. Just to give you some background, so where have we traveled, right? So in UP, we started by traveling through various districts of UP. We've traveled through Agra, Jhansi, Hamirpur. Then we entered Madhya Pradesh, where we went to Sagar, Satna, Damo, Vidisha, Panna. And finally, we've been in Bhopal for a couple of days now, bringing you stories of policy and infrastructure. So yeah, that's basically what I've covered. You can log into www.theprint.in and you will find the stories that we've done. So earlier in the day, some of us actually, we put out this questionnaire which you could fill, and there are plenty of questions that we received through those, and I will be looking into my phone here, which has all the questions, and I will be looking into it and trying to answer those questions for you. Please, though, I'd really appreciate if you guys start sending in questions, because I think, when it's live like that, it's really a much more interactive process, and you can ask me anything, feel free. So a lot of questions relevant to this that people have asked that I'd like to start. This is Ashu, who's asked, do the people whom you speak to on the ground understand or appreciate the gravity of what you're doing? Very much so, Ashu. I think that's the one thing that we saw here. We've been traveling for over a month now, and everywhere we go, we see this sense of, there are these people who've lost so much, right? And they are really, really just at this point, at least when we went at the peak of the second surge, when, there weren't many uh, outlets for them, outlets of grief for these people. So when they saw us, when they met us, they were just honestly brimming with so much anger and rage and sadness that they were just waiting to narrate their story of grief. And even amongst those people, they were constantly worried about us. We got so many people who were like, who had lost family members, who just were coping with so much grief a day or hours before we showed up, and they were still like, listen, how will you manage, are you okay, are you sure you should be traveling in these times, tum theek ho beta. So a lot of care and a lot of concern, even among people who were actually just dealing with so much in their own lives. So yes, people do definitely appreciate the gravity of what we are doing. They're very grateful. They're very thankful. They honestly also feel the sense of, look, there isn't enough independent media in the country at this moment. So whatever people can try and communicate what we are experiencing to the people at large, to the world at large, we're really grateful for that. So I think at every step, wherever we went, there were people who were extremely appreciative, and that honestly encouraged us, because what we are doing, as journalists, it can often seem like a very distressing or just like depressing job, because you're trying to bring out these stories and you feel like, okay, it's not really changing much on ground. It can be an experience that can really, really bog you down. But when you find people who are appreciative of the work you're doing, and just simply know that, okay, they feel that their voice can get through with your story, even in the long run, if it doesn't mean much, just that one story and that one person whose story you can communicate really feels like a lot in that moment. Madhav Rajwade had asked, when out in rural areas, how do you manage stays, permissions, food, and restrooms? That's a question I get a lot, Madhav, mostly from family members and extended family members who are really worried about us at this moment. Right now, a little less worried. At the peak of the lockdown, actually, when we started traveling, the lockdown had just started. And earlier there was a partial lockdown and there was a full complete lockdown in Madhya Pradesh especially. So in UP, honestly, when we started traveling, the lockdown wasn't that bad. Hotels were open, shops were open, and when I say shops, I mean you could at least pick up the food, and takeaway was still an option. When we entered Madhya Pradesh, we realized the lockdown here is way stricter, which is good in the sense that at that point what was needed was a strict lockdown. But there was also this period where we were really worried about how we're going to manage stay. So in the biggest cities, like right now I'm in Bhopal, here stay isn't that much of a problem because hotels usually remain open. But when you go to more rural areas, which we did, right? We traveled through tribal belts across Panna and Satna. And there, I remember this one particular day got really bad because, we were going and we were reporting and everything. And by the time we got done with the work, it was like 7:38, and we saw on Make My Trip and multiple hotels were open, and we went to my team and I, we went to those hotels, because at that point, we prefer booking physically once we get to the hotel, so that we know, we can confirm that the hotel is open or not and the hotel is in a good condition. So we went there, and one after the other, each hotel kept saying, no, sorry, we're closed. And even though they were showing open on Make My Trip, and it was, by that point, it was really late. I mean, when I say really, it was like 8:39, so it was dark. And we just didn't know what to do. We got really, really scared in that moment, because it's really cut off from the rest of the state, those areas, the tribal belt and the areas around that region. And we were scared, but thankfully, luckily, something worked out. We found a hotel that was still taking guests, so that worked out. But there are moments like this where you just freak out, but the idea is to not freak out. The idea is to just stay calm. Rest of the things you kind of figure out, like food is, honestly, during a lockdown, food is one of the bigger hassles, because there's no Zomato, no Swiggy, none of those things work. Then you can't even, like, hotels are, restaurants aren't open. Mostly what we've been doing for the last couple of days is that wherever we stay, usually those hotels have like their own restaurants. Those are functioning, so we eat from those restaurants. So that's how we've been managing so far. But every new district you go to, you kind of have to just figure out. You have to take it a day at a time. Honestly, if you start thinking about, okay, how am I going to manage this entire stretch? We've been out for 1 month, and we didn't know that when we began. And if we started worrying about those things on top of worrying about getting good stories, then it would be too much to honestly just process, and you're unnecessarily burdening yourself. So we just take it a day at a time. And honestly, most times it's about getting lucky, getting fortunate, to find good people around you. Like I said, wherever we'd go, people would be like, okay, you know what, if you don't find a place, you can stay at our home, or we'll help you out. And even though it was like, a time when everyone was battling so much grief and anxiety and worry, but they'd still, you find good people on the street. And honestly, it's just good people who, something an editor told me once, and it's something that I repeat often, that all of journalism relies on the kindness of strangers. Right. So all of journalism relies on the kindness of strangers. That's what this editor, she told me. And I often say it to people, other people, especially aspiring journalists. Right. So just to talk a little bit about my reporting, initially when we went out, we covered stories of just a lot of uh, people just feeling really, really angry at how the system around them was crumbling, and they just couldn't understand how this happened, right? Because the second peak, it just hit out of nowhere. Things began to look easy, smooth towards the end of last year. Obviously, everyone knew that there will be a second surge. People knew that. But no one really knows that it's going to hit their home, hit their lives so personally. And when that happens, it can be a very terrifying experience. Like in Agra, we met the family of this RSS worker who had passed away. He was followed by Prime Minister Modi on Twitter. There was, when he passed away, because and they said they didn't get enough medical resources on time. They just felt like this, like I said, this personal sense of betrayal, and just this raw anger that we sensed. And of course, it was around this time, if you remember, early to mid-May, when pictures of dead bodies floating on Ganga and Yamuna had began going viral. Very, very gory, grotesque, triggering, upsetting pictures those were for all of us, right? You do not imagine, you cannot ever contemplate this reality, fathom this reality, where it's 2021 India, and you have dead bodies, corpses literally floating on your big iconic rivers. That's not a reality that anyone could ever really contemplate or imagine or think of. And that was really difficult. And I remember we went to Hamirpur in Uttar Pradesh, which has a very big Yamuna Ghat. And we went there, and of course, the visuals of, to be fair, the number of dead bodies floating on Ganga were, of course, much more. In Yamuna, on Yamuna, at least there in Hamirpur, it was significantly fewer. But, if you think about it, even talking like this, that, okay, more dead bodies versus less dead bodies floating, it really, how we've, this reality has become so normalized. It's something that I'm only now processing. At that point, when you're out doing the story, these things don't really strike you, because at that point you're only doing it from the perspective of doing the story. But yeah, I remember there we went and we spoke to fishermen around us, who, in fact, there's a video clip from that longer video that had gone viral. In that video clip, this fisherman, Ratan, his name was, actually, I remember, just very nonchalantly, very casually, he's looking out onto the river, and he's counting dead bodies for me. He's like, oh, dekho, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, to main yahin se gin pa raha hu. He said that very nonchalantly. And it was really unfortunate, because when I started talking to the fishermen there, then I realized so many of them, this has become such a big issue for them, because you see, fishermen, they don't really have an option to not go into the river. There can be corpses floating there, but they have to keep going into the river, because their livelihoods depend on it, on going to the river and fishing. And they said that the last couple of days had become unbearable for them, because the dead bodies were still floating. Administration wasn't doing anything to take them out. The smell got unbearable. and honestly, that entire river was just enveloped with this very, very sickening stench. Of course, that of dead bodies. And I felt really bad for them at that point, because imagine, just for us sitting in our homes looking at that visual was such a difficult experience to digest. For people who live there, these people have been fishermen on that ghat for the last 15-20 years, and for them to suddenly wake up to this reality and realize that their livelihoods might be at stake is very, very difficult. And that was actually really something that people struggled with. Right. There are plenty of questions that have started coming in. Okay, let me just. There are still many people asking questions. Thank you so much, Salil, Satvik, Anirudh. I'm just taking your name so that you know that I am noting down each question, and I will definitely be addressing it in the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so. Ravi, Padmakshi, Aditya, thank you so much. Please keep sending in your questions. I will be taking each and every question, don't worry. But I just want to go back to the questions that we got earlier in the day, because I think that a lot of your questions will also get answered if we try and get those. Deepan is asking, Fatima, how do you see the field of journalism changing in the next 30 years, and what will you do to stay relevant in your profession? Thank you, Deepan. That's a very good question, even though it is a question that gives me a slight existential crisis. But thank you. You're right, Deepan. Things are changing very quickly. All professions are changing really quickly at this point. But journalism, I speak to a lot of my seniors, and they say that in the last 5 years, it's gone through such a big change, where people are constantly like, every day you are learning something new. I'm learning something new. Even though I became a journalist just a couple of years back. And I remember when I joined the industry at that point, digital journalism was just booming, and so many digital portals were rising at that point, and people were coming up with these new projects. And I do think, answer your question more directly, I think that the future of journalism, I think today, is becoming very, very digital. And of course, the present of journalism is that too, but I think in the future we see that taking the center stage in a much more prominent fashion. Even today, like newspapers, for instance, they have full teams dedicated to taking care of their website. So they have these digital teams, entirely whose work is to just maintain the website and constantly update it. I think a lot of it has to do with social media. Like I said, I speak to a lot of my seniors in the profession, and while journalism was always a pretty hectic and difficult profession, today you really don't have the luxury to take your time to file a story, because it will come out somewhere or the other, and you're constantly wanting to be wanting to maintain speed and accuracy, both of which are difficult to maintain at the same time. But that's what we strive to do here at the Print as well. We constantly want to get that good, important story out to you, and in a timely fashion, and maintain that all the accuracies and our due diligence is done, and there isn't any compromise on those ends as well. So yeah, I think that is something that is something we should look out for in the couple of years as well, next years as well. And also, it's true that because everything's becoming just so quick, and there isn't really much time for people to sit on a story, and I think a lot of it is also giving birth to a lot of fake news. Of course, there are like people who actively work to spread fake news and manufacture fake news. So I think the flip side of digital booming in the way it has is that fake news has become so much more ubiquitous, and so much more pervasive, and people really need to, I think, with digital journalism and journalism evolving, I think people would also want to evolve and be a little skeptical about what they're reading on the internet. I think back in the day, I imagine when something would be in the newspaper, you would feel like, okay, it's in the newspaper, which means it's probably true. most probably 99% true, but today I don't know how many people will be able to say that with full confidence, because of just how easy it has become to be on the internet and constantly find these pop-ups and these websites and these YouTube videos and WhatsApp forwards. Of course, how can I forget? So I think those are the interesting things to look out for in the future. Right. I will take more questions. Please, yes, ask me anything you want about my COVID reporting, about my journey or as a reporter. This is something that really interests me. I really, love interacting with viewers like that, because you learn so much about what people are thinking and what their views and opinions are on various things. Srinivas Joshi has a question. Do you ever get carried away emotionally with your story, which may affect the objectivity of reporting? Srinivas, as journalists, I think all of us, many of us, I think, wear our heart on our sleeves, because you see, this is a profession that it's a risky profession, right? You're doing a lot. You're constantly on the field. You don't know if it will work out. It won't work out in the long run, and so you're doing it for the love of reporting. That's really what's driving you to go out there, to meet people, to interview them, to do their stories. That's really what is the driving force. And so, especially on assignments like these, right, these can be very emotional assignments. They can really take a toll on you, and you can honestly just really feel for the subject. um, so yes, it is possible. It is definitely a possibility, but that's also the challenge. The idea is, how do you communicate this story most effectively, but also make sure you do your due diligence. And there's an old adage that journalists often cite. I don't know if you know it, but it says, "Don't let facts come in the way of a good story." It's a joke that people crack, that oftentimes a story will just be so perfect, be so good, like all the uh, just the right amount of emotions and tadka and all of it is just so perfect that you don't want like facts to ruin that. But the point is that facts exist for a reason, and as a good journalist, you have to be like, okay, you know what, this would be a better story because it's way more emotional, and I want my reader to really feel it. But also, these are the facts, and as a good journalist, your job is to tell the facts and nothing but the facts and the truth. So yeah, that's a challenge and a task, but it needs to be done. Right. So I'm going to start taking some questions. Lots of questions coming in here. Ravi Sehgal is asking, what is the feeling of villagers toward vaccination? Ravi, we actually did a story on this. It was one of the earliest stories we did a couple of weeks back. It's on the villagers in Panna. Panna is a mostly a tribal district in Madhya Pradesh. Some of the areas within Panna are extremely poor. Malnutrition is a big problem there. And we actually went there and we met various families whose kids were reeling with issues of malnutrition, and COVID just only exacerbated that later on. And that made things really bad for them. And we were talking to them, and we didn't really go there with the intention of finding the story of vaccine hesitancy. But when we started talking to the people there, we were like, it's so interesting actually. One person there, she told us that all the villages, all the households in this particular village fell sick in the month of April, mid-April. Everyone here was down with fever, and this was like a village of good 800,000 people. They were like, every single household had members who were down with fever and body ache and cold and cough, basically all your classic symptoms of COVID, and at the same time. But interestingly, none of them went for testing or uh, opted for COVID treatment or went to get treated for COVID, went to a hospital or to a doctor. They said, some of us just took jadi booty, and the rest of us just went to temples, and when we just prayed and we were fine. There's no way we're going out for treatment. And then I was like, okay, but what about vaccination? Do you want to get vaccinated now? And they said, no way. In fact, they won't even talk to us. It's so funny. So many of them thought that we are there to vaccinate them. That we have people from Delhi who are just there to vaccinate them, and they were like, go away, go away. And then we had to convince them that, look, we're not here to vaccinate you. Don't worry. And then they were like, in fact, they explicitly said we'd rather die of corona than die of sui. By sui, they meant vaccine. And it's not like they denied the existence of corona. All of them said, yeah, it's legitimate, but we don't want to go and get a vaccination because, we've heard somewhere in some village that people are dying of vaccination. And I said, where? Tell me the origin of this. Who has died? Do you know this person? What are you talking about? And when you'd ask them a little more, if you try to probe a little, they'd immediately say, यहाँ नहीं हुआ है, we don't know, it's not happened in this village, but we've heard, so basically all of these were rumors. Of course, a lot of rumors of infertility also, vaccination leading to infertility, a lot of rumors, and it was really, really scary to see, because they were like, we don't want to die, and we know that we die if we take a vaccination. And it's really unfortunate because India, remember, years ago did a splendid job with polio vaccination, but of course, a lot of people needed to come together in order to try and discourage and fight the vaccine hesitancy. Even now, I think that's needed. It's so unfortunate that we are battling these twin issues. One issue is of gross vaccine shortages that we were seeing earlier in May. And at the same time, this problem where people just don't want to get vaccinated because they're like, we'll die. But I'd like to say this, even though this particular story was from a tribal region and it was from a village, I know for a fact that vaccine hesitancy is not limited to villages. It's something that I know so many people in urban areas who also very easily fall for these rumors. I know so many of young professionals who are struggling to convince their parents to get vaccinated because their parents are like, no, we don't trust it. So I do think this is a bigger problem of like not just vaccine hesitancy but trust deficit in the system. People don't trust the system. People don't know what they're going to be poked with and what is exactly going into their bodies. So this is a greater issue of trust deficit that I think needs to be tackled and looked into as that. Okay. Aditya has asked a good question. How many people were able to recognize the print or your team? We see you folks on YouTube regularly, but how much has online media penetrated in rural areas? Aditya, I've been a reporter with print. This is where I started out 3 years ago. And I agree, when we started out, so I've been traveling for a couple of years now, right? Earlier last year for different assignments, I had to go to UP repeatedly. And oftentimes we'd see the people won't immediately recognize the print. They won't instantly connect to it because in rural areas still either people have like their traditional age-old newspapers that they've been reading for the last 60-70 years, or there's TV, right? Hindi news channels mostly. But this time around, it's actually an interesting shift that I noticed, that people recognize the print. I didn't need to explain what the print is. People knew it. People knew of it. And it was really, really interesting and good to see that. And I think it's mostly through YouTube, right? People really today watch videos a lot. I'd argue more than they read, definitely. And so people would immediately go like, okay, yeah, I've seen your video. I've seen this video on YouTube of yours. So that was a good shift, interesting shift, welcoming shift for me personally, that people did recognize us and people recognized the print. Okay. More questions, please. Yes, ask me whatever questions you have. Salil is asking, how often do you face people not willing to speak to journalists? Has this percentage increased or decreased or stayed the same in the last few years? Salil, I think that whenever people don't want to talk to journalists, I feel that there's no one to blame but journalists. I think that Indian media has earned a certain reputation, and you can argue it's a different reputation in different pockets of the country and different areas, and people from different classes have different biases about perspectives or perceptions about Indian media. But whenever someone's skeptical or doesn't want to talk to a journalist, I always try and understand why. I'm not really confrontational with them. My approach mostly is, so it can be two reasons, right? One, either they don't want to talk, because when I say they, I mean ordinary people, not government officials, because they mostly don't want to talk because of other reasons. But when I'm saying ordinary people, when they don't want to talk, I try and understand why that is. It could just be because in some cases there's they feel embarrassed or shy to talk about something. They feel that if they talk about it and it comes out on media, then it will be something that will be embarrassing. It will be personal embarrassment for them. In many other cases, it's because they feel that media might not represent their story very well, or might be or manipulated, or be exploitative, or take it out of context. So that is a concern and that is a worry, and I feel the best way to tackle that is to reassure them and tell them, look, it's okay, whatever you say, we will communicate it exactly in those many words, and please don't worry about it. And you basically have to earn their trust, and that is my responsibility, my duty as a journalist. When I'm going on the field and entering someone else's home, I'm taking their precious time. So it is my duty to make sure that they feel comfortable talking to me. So I'm never like judgmental or confrontational about it. Mostly when and to answer your question about has it gone up or down, I think people don't mind talking to journalists generally. I don't think they do unless there's a good reason for them to not. And in my experience, mostly if you are able to make them comfortable, then they will talk to you and they will be free and open with you. Any more questions? Okay. Abdul Rauf had asked a very interesting question. He asked, what kind of pre-study does a reporter need to do before going out to observe an event, then publish a report on that? Does the reporter use a colleague as a sounding board before finalizing the report? Abdul, that is an excellent question. And personally, I definitely like to use my colleagues as sounding boards, because I think it's really good to just like, a lot of times when you're reporting a story, so a story on an average, say for right now, takes a day and a half, maximum 2 days. You can't really sit on a story for too long unless like it's a really long story where there are a lot of loose ends to tie. But a lot of times you can get really engrossed in a story even if you're not working on it for too long. It's in those 2 days that story is my priority, nothing else is my priority. Getting that story out is my priority. So again, I'm spending night and day talking to people, trying to get that story out and trying to make sure that that story is the best version of the story that it could possibly be. And so you can get really engrossed into it, and a lot of times it helps to have a fresh pair of eyes that will read your story, who will and it can come from anyone, right? A lot of times it comes from the editor who you talk to about your story, that hey, this is a story I found. And a lot of times they can be like, hey, how about this sounds like a better or more interesting angle to approach the story from. And that can be a moment of like, oh yeah, I didn't think of that because I was just so into the story from this particular angle. A lot of times it can come from people who are editing our copies or stories, the desk editors. They can be editing your story and can be like, hey, this is a much more interesting aspect that you put down lower in your copy and it should probably come higher up. And you're like, yeah, that makes complete sense. So stuff like that really helps. A lot of times the photographer or the camera person that you're traveling with, or whoever's basically with you, accompanying you for that trip, a lot of times the driver who's accompanying you, in fact, can be just a great source of discussing your stories with and just understanding them from a different lens, different perspective. So those things really help. I think generally talking about your stories, communicating about them really helps polish them, finesse them a little more than in your head. An anonymous attendee, this person doesn't have their name listed, is asked, do you go somewhere with the intention of looking for a certain kind of story? Usually newsworthy is equal to negative. Are you also open to other example positive stories? I wish you gave me your name, but I completely understand if you don't want to. But yes, I mean, I understand how people often complain that media organizations are obsessed with negative stories. But you have to understand, when we go out on the field, especially right now, right? I'll just give an example. With COVID, there's literally nothing you can know beforehand, because generally things are really bad. Grief is back to the rafters, and that things are just abysmal. but that's all you know. And everywhere you go, you can't do the same story. So when I say hit, I mean when you enter a new district, you really you can't go with any approach, or you can't go with a fixed mindset, because you don't know. And this is just generally something that I always tell people around me, or the journalists, my peers, that let the field surprise you. And honestly, sometimes you will be taken aback by what you see on the field. It can be just such a that this is why I really enjoy reporting, because it can be such a surprising, overwhelming experience, where every notion that you've held until that moment can just break down to smithereens in a matter of few seconds. So yeah, I mean, the field often surprises us as reporters. To answer your question more specifically, I don't think that any journalist ever goes into the field thinking of, okay, I want to do a negative story today. Uh, the thing is, when you say negative, what do you mean? Do you mean a lapse in policy, or a loophole in some implementation of some scheme, or a crumbling health infrastructure? All of these stories, these aren't negative stories. These are important stories that need to be told. Uh, these are stories that if we as journalists see it, watch it happening, if it's happening in front of our eyes, and if we don't report it, we are failing in our duty as journalists. That said, even in my just this trip of mine, this COVID trip of mine, I found so many beautiful stories of hope and kindness. Two particular stories that stand out that I'd like to quickly mention. One of them, in Jabalpur, we met Ashish Thakur, who was a banker, successful banker. For the last 20 years, he's been helping perform the last rites of people who are abandoned bodies, who don't have families. He's been doing that. But during the last year, during COVID, he got so involved in this process. He quit his job of that of a banker, and he's just been performing the last rites, cremating as well as burying those who don't have families, and even in some cases who have families but who can't afford a cremation or a burial. He's been doing that, and that's just great selflessness at display there. Another very good story that a lot of people actually read and liked and appreciated was the story in Bhopal, where these group of friends, they wanted to distribute food and do charity work during the lockdown, but they realized that whenever they do charity, or anyone does charity, there's this tendency to click their picture and post it on social media. But they were like, look, charity for the sake of publicity defeats the purpose, and we're not okay with that. So the solution that they came up with was very interesting. They would wear these Guy Fawkes masks from V for Vendetta, popularized by V for Vendetta. They'd wear that, and they'd go around. They're going around still, even today, distributing food and ration, which I thought was excellent. And these are two stories that we did. And maybe these count as positive stories, but they're important stories too. So that is something that we like to cover. And we cover what needs to be covered, and what is of course important, or what stands out. And this could be negative or positive, but these are stories that need to be done regardless. Okay, more questions. Vishesh Iyer has asked a question. I would like to know more about the integrity to be maintained by the journalist in reporting, and the various dimensions and perspectives involved. Vishesh, as journalists, whenever we write a story, whenever we report a story, it's important to get all versions, all sides of the story. And there isn't anything like exemplary in it. I think most journalists who are worth their salt, who average reporters, decent reporters, people who are just going every day, trying to get you a good story, they do this. This is just part of our job. That okay, if you're going to the field, I'm seeing this story, I'm seeing something play out in front of me, I then go to the authorities, which can be government authorities or whoever's in charge, and ask them about their version of events, or ask them for an explanation of why something's happening and not happening. And that's just my job as a journalist, and that is just something that needs to be done and taken care of. And that's something that all of us as journalists try our level best to do. Oftentimes we might not be able to do an exceptional job. Oftentimes we might not do exactly what we set out to do, but we are always trying. And that is something that needs to be. I think it deserves some kind of appreciation. Oh, Gopinath has a very good question. What were your reservations about joining this field, and how did you convince yourself that this is meant for you? A lot of questions about my journey as a journalist. I do not mind. Please feel free to ask, especially if you're an aspiring journalist. I would always love to help. Gopinath, I think when you're setting out to be a journalist, you are driven by different things, and they're very subjective, and they can be different for different people, and that's okay. But I think for most people, and I'm saying this in my experience of talking to other journalists, my peers, my colleagues here at the Print and otherwise, most of what drives us is this desire to tell stories, and this desire to be able to write and report, or whatever, if you're a multimedia journalist, to be on video, and then to be able to communicate something that you feel isn't being communicated adequately enough, or is being communicated, and you'd like to be a part of that cycle of communication or the chain of communication in whichever capacity. So I think before any of us strive to be journalists or want to be journalists, it's a good question to ask. You need to sit down and you need to ask yourself, okay, what's driving me to do this? And I think for me it was that drive to tell stories. And I think once you recognize that, once you identify it, it's easier to kind of convince yourself to go into their profession. And I'd argue that all professions are a gamble, all professions are a risk of certain extent, of course some more, some less, but it's important to know why you're doing something, I think, generally in life. And yeah, I guess that's an answer. I think I'm still every day I'm taking it one day at a time and seeing what more avenues within journalism I want to pursue and get better at. Lakshya is asking, did you get a chance to interview doctors in rural areas? What's their state of mind? Lakshya, we did. We met plenty of doctors because we went to plenty of hospitals in rural areas. A lot of them just working so hard night and day. It was honestly just some places they were just overwhelmed with patients within the hospital, patients outside the hospital, waiting in queues to get treated. It was just honestly a sad state of affairs because intuitively the doctors are trying their best in most places, and when you see, despite all their efforts, things coming crashing down the way they are, you feel for them. Honestly, I felt for doctors in a lot of places. One interesting phenomenon that we saw and we witnessed in rural areas particularly was that in Satna, for instance, Satna is a district in Madhya Pradesh. A lot of the regions were, they've been categorized as hotspots, basically meaning that there's a surge of cases in those areas. But when we went to those areas, we realized that a lot of the government hospitals there, they were empty. And we were like, wait, that doesn't add up. How's that happening? And then we spoke to doctors there, and they were actually really upset about this fact. And they said that, look, we know that there are a lot of cases, and we know that people are testing positive, but they're not coming to hospitals because they don't trust hospitals. They don't trust doctors. And we were like, what? That's just so unfortunate. Okay, but where are they going if they're not coming here? And they said that they're going to quacks, or people who work as medical professionals but don't really have a medical professional degree, also known as jhola chaps in more colloquial terms. And then we went and we spent time with a lot of these quacks. And then when we went and we also spoke to a lot of villagers, and we asked them that, look, why aren't you going to hospitals? Why are you preferring quacks over them? And honestly, all of them had perfectly good reasons, and were their reasons which I respect completely. They said that, look, we come from a poor family, and we've been going, whenever we've gone to hospitals in the past, we've never really gotten good treatment. People haven't even paid heed to our demands. We're not treated with basic dignity. At least a quack would sit us down, would give us some treatment, would listen to our problems, would pay heed to our concerns. And that's what we want. We want to be felt like we are being taken care of, which is what all of us want, right? Whenever we go to a doctor, that's basically what we're looking for. And they said that government hospitals just don't give us that, and so we don't care if this person doesn't have a professional degree. They've helped us plenty of times in the past. They'll help us now. We trust them over hospitals any day. And that was for me personally really interesting, to go into rural areas and find these perspectives, because intuitively you'd be like, hey, why is that happening? Why are people going to quacks? I mean, and it's easy to dismiss this and attribute this to just like lack of literacy and lack of education, but there's much more to it. And I think when you go out on the field, you'll be really surprised and intrigued by the kind of things that you see there. More questions? Any more questions? Please feel free to ask me anything. I'm on the field for a couple of days, for, like I said, a month now, and there's just been so many experiences that I have had. So whatever questions you have, please feel free to ask me, and I'd love to take them for you. Anything whatsoever. Padmakshi has asked, please narrate any incident which moved you and made you ponder over again and again in this time of pandemic. Wow. So many, Padmakshi. And the thing with me is that I also, when I'm working, I have this approach towards work where I'm like, I'll just focus on work and I'll keep working and I'll process all of this later. Like earlier also, as journalists, we cover a lot of things, right? If you covered a riot or any violent incident, a lot of times can be very emotionally grueling. But my strategy is to just keep working and process it later and reflect upon it later, which might not be the healthiest. So I do not recommend it. But I think this particular trip, a lot of stories will stay with me. I think one story of, just recently, the one that we did on Bhopal gas tragedy victims, it's been 36 years since the Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984. Lots of people exposed to this toxic gas because of a leak in a very famous popular plant here, pesticide plant. The ramifications of it are still being felt 36 years later. Of course, many people died because of that, but many people who survived, called the Bhopal gas tragedy survivors, they were left with a lot of lung issues, battling lung issues all their lives. And then COVID hits, which is just so devastating. It is the worst double whammy possible because honestly, all this while they were dealing with lung issues, and then they're hit by a pandemic that affects lungs. It was just, and we met so many families of gas tragedy survivors who had died because of COVID. So 36 years, they're battling this, they're trying to figure out their life, they're trying to get back on their feet. Of course, remember, all of them, most of them were just really, really poor people who were affected by it. And then suddenly this happens again. And, it was really unfortunate to talk to them. Just so much sadness and grief in their lives that it makes you feel really helpless, honestly, as a journalist. And like I said, there's nothing you can do but write their stories and report their stories, because anything more than that would just be a burden I for one, would collapse under. So for me, I think my duty and my responsibility is to just get the job done and narrate their stories and write their stories. Right. So I think we have a couple more minutes to go, after which we'd have to bid you goodbye. So any more questions, please ask. All right, I don't see more questions coming in, so I would like to end this live now. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it. All of us at ThePrint really appreciate it. You can write to me if you have any more questions. You can find me at fatima.khan at theprint.in. On Twitter, I'm at @Khan the Fatima. And yes, all of us at ThePrint, really thank you. Thank you so much for subscribing to us. Like I said, it's because of you that I'm on the field. So many of my colleagues are out in the field trying to get these stories. You must understand, these are really, really projects that require a lot of money, and they require a lot of resources. So it's good people like you who are subscribed to ThePrint, who enable us to endeavor and try and achieve some of these stories. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for tuning in and sending your questions.